Muslims tend to frown upon the idea of following God alone as if it's not sufficient enough and that we need His own creation to help deliver and decode what He Himself claims to be a fully explained book. In this video, I'm going to be covering the Prophet Muhammad forbidding writing of the Hadiths, the Quran speaking of fabricated Hadiths, the denouncing of Hadiths during the Khalifas, and Hadiths insulting God. We are forgetting God's direct divine message that is specifically warning us of Hadiths and telling us not to follow anything other than one book, one God, and nothing else. In this video, I'm finally going to be putting to rest the traditional ways of Islam versus what God specifically tells us in His divine book. And after that, you'll be responsible for picking either God's way or man's way. A question asked is, have you been blinded by the masses into following man-made lies? If you're cringing right now and feel some type of way about what I'm saying, then maybe you are one of those that need to pay close attention to this video. It's been documented in Sahih Muslim and in other sources of Hadith that the Prophet Muhammad has prohibited the writing of Hadith. We claim with confidence that we are on the right path, but not only does the Quran say not to follow Hadith, but our own Hadiths say the same thing. So if you choose to follow blindly and disregard what God says in the book, how is it that we're suggesting we need Hadiths to explain the Quran, but when the Hadith tells you that the Prophet forbade the Hadith and the writing of the Hadith, we choose to make the Hadith pillars of our faith? All Hadith collections we have today, which are considered authentic by the Hadith scholars, were written 200 years after the death of the Prophet. But for 2 centuries, in accordance to the instructions left by the Prophet, Hadiths were not permitted. Hence why it took 200 years for them to start adopting it. Knowing that the Prophet banned any documentation of Hadiths, knowing that the Quran speaks specifically of fabricated Hadiths, and mentions that whoever mentions Hadiths is considered the enemy of the Prophet. One is left to wonder how these Hadiths have formulated the roots and the pillars of Islam today. In chapter 6 verse 112 it says, "And thus we have made every prophet enemies from amongst the human and the jinn," or the devil. "They inspire to one another fancy sayings in order to deceive. Had your God willed, they would have not done it. You shall disregard them and what they fabricate." So God's telling you here to disregard anything other than what God Himself says. But when you hear this, all you can think of is it possible that the majority of Muslims are wrong? They must be following the truth. I mean, can they all be doing something that is incorrect? So let's assess the situation here and break it down. Have you specifically and unconditionally studied God's words? No, you have not. If you haven't, and others follow the same model as you, then how are you so convinced and so sure that you are on the right path? Because you are putting all your trust into these big bearded sheikhs, hoping, praying to God that they are right. You're actually not praying. You are so convinced that they are right. You yourself have done nothing to contribute to your worldly obligations to seek the truth, other than blindly following others and assuming that they have done all the work for you. Well, newsflash, unfortunately, you don't need a Muslim to tell you this, that nothing worth having comes free. Are we not on earth to be tested? Do people think that they will be left to say, "We believe," without being tested? We certainly test those before them, and Allah will clearly distinguish between those who are truthful and those who are liars. So do you really think that God is giving so-called Muslims the free card to salvation without any work at all? Have you done any work to verify any of the traditional practices of Islam that you are following right now? If not, then you need to entertain the option of you not being fully on the path prescribed by God. God spoke clearly of a code of law that He has sent down, and following or not following this code of law that God has sent down will be our test. In Surah 5 verse 48, "To each of you we have ordained a code of law, a way of life." And then God goes on to say, "But His will is to test you with what He has given you." He's testing you with what he has given you sounds like a book, and it doesn't sound like books made by men. Also, chapter 6, verse 114 to 115. Shall I seek other than God as a lawmaker, when it is he who has brought down the book fully detailed? A book full of details. Shall you seek other than God? It's a fully detailed book. Why are we not obeying God's command and upholding no hadiths other than the Quran? Surah 45 verse 6. These are God's revelations that we recite to you with truth. So in which hadith other than God and his revelations do you believe? You still find it hard to break off the traditional ways in fear of maybe disappointing mommy and daddy, maybe being criticized by the community, or maybe worried about your friends and they're not going to be there for you no more. Well, unfortunately, we're not going to be here in general for too long. So I suggest doing what is right. The books of Hadith report that the Prophet prohibited the writing of his Hadith and that his followers would not write anything from him other than what the Quran says. It is also documented that the Prophet maintained his stance until he died. Here's some proof, here's some proof, and here's some proof. For the Muslims that are watching this right now, what do you have to say when you know that God is very clear to saying in his book that not to follow any hadiths? But then when you look in your own books, which you don't do, and you see references stating the same thing that God says, not to follow man-made books. But wait, maybe you didn't know that because you're not putting or studying or putting in that effort and figuring things out and relying fully on other men to tell us what to do. So some hadith scholars try to imply that the Prophet changed his view about writing the hadith. However, the following hadith was reported 30 years after the Prophet died, and the Prophet Muhammad never authorized the writing of hadith after instructing his followers not to write anything other than the Quran. The writing and documentation of hadith is an interesting and important part of the Islamic history. God repeatedly confirmed in the Quran that the book is complete. Chapter 6 verse 19, chapter 6 verse 38, chapter 6 verse 114 and 115, and that there was no need for anything else. He actually said we would have given you hundreds of books, not just one Quran, if needed. Chapter 18 verse 109, chapter 31 verse 27. God clearly states that if there was a need for another book, he would have provided it, but he didn't provide it. The four guided Khalifas who ruled the Muslim nation after the death of the Prophet Muhammad respected the command of the Prophet and prohibited the writing of hadiths. Abu Bakr at one point was not sure whether to keep what he knew of hadiths or not. He had collected over 500 hadiths during the very long companionship that he had with the Prophet, but he could not sleep until he burned them all. One of the main people that has documented hadiths is Abu Huraira, and Umar called Abu Huraira a liar and threatened to send him back to Yemen where he was from if he did not stop telling lies about the Prophet Muhammad. So he decided to stop until Umar died and then started back again. Umar is also reported to have stated that he had the desire, no different than Abu Bakr, to write collections of what the Prophet said because they were with him all the time. But he restrained for the fear of Muslims choosing to adopt the teachings of these sayings and forgetting or abandoning God's words. Something that we have full-heartedly done today. Oh, wait a minute, that sounds pretty familiar because according to the Quran, the Prophet on Judgment Day, chapter 25, verse 30, literally states that my people have abandoned the book. We don't pay attention to God's words. We don't pay attention to the Khulafat. We don't pay attention to the 300 years of not practicing hadith and how the Prophet banned it. We are not paying attention. We are just blindly inheriting ignorance. The prohibiting of hadith was continued until Umar ibn Abdul Aziz permitted the writing of hadiths. In these books, a new religion was written that dominated over the Quran, despite them claiming the opposite. In writing these books, the authors did not care if the hadith contradicted the Quran or if they contradicted other hadiths. The number of hadith collected and attributed to the Prophet is in the hundreds of thousands, and to be accurate, it's about 700,000. The majority of these hadiths are pure lies and fabrications and were rejected by the early Muslim scholars. Malik ibn Anas collected 500 hadiths from his famous book, Ahmad ibn Hanbal collected 40,000 hadith, his famous Masnad, and he chose 40,000 out of 700,000 hadiths. In other words, that's a 666,000 hadiths were unproven, lied, fabricated, and he did not choose any of them. He did not choose 94% of the hadiths. Bukhari collected 600,000 hadiths. He accepted 7,275 hadiths and considered 592,000 of them lies and fabrications. That's a 99% of what he collected he considered unauthentic. Muslim collected 300,000 hadith, which he accepted 4,000 in his book and rejected 296,000. That's 99% out in the garbage. Are we not questioning this? We're putting these books right next to the Quran. We formed our whole religion on this. This gives us an idea of how much corruption has entered into the back door of Islam. So Abu Hurairah takes the first place for narrations of hadiths, but was the least respected amongst all the narrators. He stayed in the company of the Prophet for 2 years, but managed to narrate more than 5,000 hadiths. God describes the Quran as being the best hadith in chapter 39, verse 23. And that we should not believe in any other hadiths other than the Quran, chapter 45, verse 6, chapter 7, verse 185. Bukhari is just one of several scholars who decided to collect the hadith despite the clear instructions left by the Prophet Muhammad and all his Khalifas to not do so. While current Christianity is largely the product of Paul's corruption and fabrications, the traditional Islam way today is the product of the corruption of the true religion of Islam by people like Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Dawood, all these scholars that chose to break the law of God and break what the Prophet mentioned. As soon as Muslims deserted the Quran in favor of the Hadith, their religion was corrupted beyond belief. The practice of Islam today is not the practice of what God ordained in His book. Muslim scholars who came after Bukhari were too afraid to expose the truth and the shortcomings of these scholars because nobody has the willingness to go against the wave. Nobody has the willingness to speak the truth. We would rather inherit and adopt ways that are wrong. A lot of them know this and a lot of them don't. A lot of them don't because they just inherit and they study what is given to them. No different than med school, same thing. You go to med school and you're given these books, but the books are funded by the pharmaceutical companies. It's the same idea. You're going to school, you want to become a sheikh or an imam, but you're following the jurisprudence of your family. So you're going into a Sunni school of thought or a Shia school of thought, and you're just inheriting the knowledge that they give you. The problem here is that we are focusing so much on these man-made books, and we've made it a staple in our whole faith that we are not actually paying attention to what God is saying. Is it the last time I checked? Religion or faith is a connection between you and God. You cannot force people into following what you follow. That is ignorance of culture. Keep it on a very simple level. If you claim to be a person trying to seek the truth, then open your ears and pay attention to what God is saying. He left you a book for a reason. If He wanted there to be a prophet right now, He would have kept it just and left every ummah or every time there was a group of people or mankind, there was a prophet that they can go to. But He left you a book. A book now. There's no prophet to speak to. The minute you go and talk to different opinionated men is the minute you start getting different opinions. Like the video, give it a thumbs up. Share it if you see some value in it. And if you didn't like it, oh well.